Okay, the second paper of this panel from Jennifer Gordon. The paper is titled "In the Zone: Work at the Intersection of Trade and Migration." Jennifer, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So this paper is a part of a larger project of mine, a new project on what I call double labor arbitrage, which I'll explain in a second, but which itself is part of an extended exploration of the intersections and parallels and discontinuities between trade and migration in theory and practice. So just by way of context, how I'm coming to this. So the larger project on double labor arbitrage, through that project, I'm looking at a range of situations in which transnational firms and states make it possible for capital to maximize profit by combining two strategies that are generally thought of as separate. One is the moving of production to a lower cost country, and the other, while in that country, is the hiring of still cheaper labor in the form of migrant workers. And there are many ways that firms achieve this. The larger project looks at all of them, but this paper focuses on one, which is host countries that establish free trade zones, often known by other names as well, special export zones, for example, with the express purpose of attracting foreign capital, and then make migrant workers available to firms within the zone as a sort of further inducement to production there. And I'll just note, given the conversation between Adam and Bartek and Avinoam this morning about whether BLAs happen and migration happens where trade really is, or capital mobility really isn't possible. This is an example where we're seeing both human mobility and the mobility of capital and production intersecting rather than substituting for each other. So my paradigm cases in this paper are ones in which three things are going on. One is the host government or some kind of trade agreement has lowered or eliminated tariffs for imports and exports in the zone. Second, the host government has waived or modified domestic law that imposes costs on firms producing in the zone. So taxes, fees, access to infrastructure, regulatory compliance of various kinds. And then finally, the host government has made possible the contracting of migrants on temporary visas. And as those of you who had time to see the paper saw, the case studies that I offer include the Jordanian garment industry that takes place in export zones, which relies largely on South Asian migrant women, the Malaysian production of electronics in special economic zones, largely Southeast Asian migrant workers, and the border garment production zones in Thailand on the border with Myanmar, where the workers are largely Burmese. I also am wondering about the petroleum extraction industry and seafood processing. They have some, but not all, of the elements of my paradigm cases. And as you saw in the paper, I'm actively looking for other cases. I'm trying to figure out whether these are weird or typical in some important way. And I hope our conversation will help me get closer to understanding that. So I would note that although some of these zones in my paradigm cases are covered by bilateral labor agreements, and most are covered by some kind of bilateral or regional trade agreement, there is no coordination between the two forms of agreements. And although in general, the trade agreements are strictly followed, consistent with what many of the papers here at this conference find, in the zones I'm looking at, the bilateral labor agreements where they exist have generally had little or no impact, particularly on the rights of the migrant workers. Another thing I do in the paper is to highlight the rhetoric of freedom as it arises in these zones, showing how the legally structured unfreedom of the migrant workers in these zones underwrites the legally structured various freedoms offered to firms in the zones, which functionally, of course, increases the surplus available for their appropriation. And then finally, I conclude by noting with concern either the resurgence or the new presentation of two policy arguments. One is what I call zone as border, the idea that it's good policy and effective to stop would-be migrants from leaving a country by encouraging or in some ways requiring them instead to work in zones in their home country, which is based, as I lay out in the paper, on the intuitive but apparently empirically incorrect theory that trade and migration are substitutes. I think it's a fair read of the literature to say instead that trade and migration are, at least in the short and medium term, largely complements. That is to say, an increase in trade tends to increase migration, at least for 10 to 15 years. But in any case, despite the lack of empirical support as a policy matter, that argument continues to be made. And I talk about Mexico and Morocco, and particularly Honduras, as sites where that argument is being made now. And the second area is a new one. I call that zone as gift, which is the argument that creating a zone to contain mobile workers is a humanitarian intervention, particularly with regard to refugees, and that it is good humanitarian policy to keep refugees from leaving host countries and moving on generally to countries in the global north by having countries in the global north use trade to give aid to the host countries on the condition that they create employment for refugees and the tying of that to export and export zones. And you can see there where zone as gift becomes zone as border quite quickly. And so I talked briefly about a couple examples there. The same Jordanian zones where South Asian migrant women work, there was an effort to add and then eventually supplement those women with Syrian women refugees. There was also a similar plan in Ethiopia that as yet has not panned out. So I think I'll stop there. That should give you a sense of what I set out in the paper.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jennifer. Our respondent is Hila Shamil. Hila, please.
Okay, so thank you. Sorry, you're hearing so much from me today. There was a scheduling problem. I promise not to be as prominent in following days. Okay, so thank you, Jennifer, for this really, really wonderful paper and presentation. So in her paper, Jennifer takes us to a unique geographical and political location where trade and migration intersect, the free trade zone. She discusses the free trade zone as a distinct class of location for global production, but I think what I may try to do in my brief comments is to actually wonder how distinct they are. So Gorder identifies three shared elements to such zones. She just described them. She discusses the double labor arbitrage in free zones that these shared elements produce. She highlights the way corporate freedom produces workers' unfreedom in the zones. And then she debunks the two narratives about the zones that she just presented. One is the zone as border, based on an assumption that development will curb migration. And the second is the zone as gift, that assumes its potential to provide relief in the form of income and occupation to refugees, again, empirically unsubstantiated. Both suggests are wrong and are not supported empirically. Then Gordon poses a revealing question. For whom is a free trade zone free? How does it create surplus, and what does that surplus, and where does that surplus go? The answer we remain with is mostly corporations. Maybe only also the countries in which these free trade zones exist, not clear in the paper how much they benefit. But definitely corporations benefit a lot. That's a double labor arbitrage. And that's at the cost of human rights and labor rights of workers in these zones. So in my comment today, I want to focus on several points raised in this article and ask some questions about the legal infrastructure that supports the free trade zone, mostly bilateral or regional trade agreements and bilateral labor agreements. Now, I mostly want to ask, what can free zones teach us about BLAs? And I will do that in 4 ways. I'll first ask, what's the role and interest of corporations in BLAs? The second thing I'll do is kind of focus on the interaction between trade and labor agreements and the ties between the mobility of goods and of people. The third will be to think about BLAs in free zones vis-a-vis BLAs that seek to provide migrants to domestic economic interests in the receiving country, so regular BLAs. And the fourth will be about migration governance as border and migration governance as gift. Okay, so I'll do each one of these briefly, bear with me. So first, the interest of corporations. So first, I want to begin by stressing the importance of this paper and the wider topic of this conference and what we're discussing. So Gordon's analysis brings to the forefront the interest of capital in such zones, and therefore also in trade and labor agreements. Now, much of the literature about BLAs focuses on the interest of governments. This is what Yuval and I just did this morning, and lots of other literature takes this approach. And it makes sense considering the fact that it's a G2G instrument, right? Government to government instrument. It's an international tool. Yet by moving the scholarly gaze from the legal instrument to the geographical economic zone that it regulates and the complicated, seemingly uncoordinating legal instruments that regulate it, Gordon reminds us who are the big beneficiaries from such instruments. It's large corporations, manufacturers, and lead firms in global value chains. This insight makes me question the analysis Yuval and I developed, introduced just a couple of minutes ago in our article early today. By focusing on state interest in control, are we missing the corporate interest? Or put differently, in this stage of globalization, how can we disintegrate, and should we disintegrate, the interests of states from those of corporations? Now, I think we can and we should disintegrate them, right, normatively. But this leads me to a methodological question. How can we trace the fingerprints of corporations, of lobbyists of corporation, of economic interests in our analysis of BLAs? Okay, so second comment that kind of is related, flows from that, regarding the interaction between trade and labor agreements. And the ties between the mobility of goods and people. So in her wonderful article already mentioned here, People Are Not Bananas, Jennifer already opened up the productive analysis of comparing the international governance of the movement of labor and the movement of goods, and she continues to do this in this article. I'll also say that Tamar Megiddo here also has a forthcoming article that pushes the envelope further and compares the movement of labor and the movement of capital in bilateral investment agreements. What we see in free trade zone is a zone where maybe all three, maybe just two. I don't know if there are also investment agreements involved. That's kind of a question to Jennifer. But anyway, we see this intersection when at least trade agreements and labor agreements meet to produce an economic wonderland for corporations. Gordon says in our article on page 8, that while firms in the paradigm cases are coordinating their use of capital and labor mobility to maximize profit, host governments are coordinating the availability of these strategies to attract firms to the zone. But at the bilateral or regional level, the governance of capital and labor mobility is anything but coordinated. Right? We have this conundrum here that allegedly, well, not allegedly, we see that the corporations are really very strategic, receiving the countries that have these zones are very strategic about bringing in the money, and then the coordination between the instruments is kind of messy. The zones are governed by trade agreements and sometimes BLAs, but Jennifer says neither acknowledges the existence of the other, much less attempting to regulate in tandem. So these agreements are usually concluded by entirely different country pairs and have very different impact on the ground. This observation emphasizes the different power relations that countries opening up free zones enter and the complexity of bilateral regulation. But is Gordon's conclusion that BLAs are kind of merely symbolic? Because she says eventually on the ground they don't know much. They make no impact on the ground. Then that brings me back to our original questions. And why are they there, right? Do BLAs regulate specifically migration into free trade zone? In our analysis that Yuval and I did of those 90 BLAs, we didn't find such BLAs that do specifically trade zones. It seems like maybe they're general BLAs, and if so, do they? And if they're different, then if they are different, then how are they different? And can we imagine BLAs and trade agreements created in a multilateral setting in a coordinated way? Will that be good for workers? Can BLAs improve the working conditions of workers in the free zones? Or Jennifer, are you not even going there? It's not the direction you're interested in. Okay, my third set of comments, and I'll be very brief, as are questions that relate to the similarity and differences of BLAs in free trade zone and kind of regular BLAs that seek to provide workers for local businesses in the receiving country. So Jennifer, you identify the double labor arbitrage in free trade zones. BLAs operating at the background of kind of run-of-the-mill labor migration carry only the single arbitrage of reducing the cost of labor. And in your comments to participants, Jennifer, she asked us how to see if we can think of additional examples of situations where states offer firms the option of hiring legally authorized transnational labor migrants as an inducement for investment in the zone. And I'm wondering about a spectrum we can create here of different forms of state inducement of local and foreign firms to invest and produce in a country using labor migration as an incentive, right? And I can think of different forms of this happening in Israel. The state creates tax breaks for local firms to produce in border zones, the border with Palestine, with the Palestinian Authority. In Israel, it's in the settlements, kind of, and the double labor arbitrage is the availability of daily laborers from the occupied Palestinian territories, but it's for Israeli businesses. The Israeli government signed an arms deal with Turkey. It will fix Turkish tanks, and in response, it agrees to accept Turkish posted workers working for a Turkish posted company in Israel. We have the same complexity and arbitrage happening in different ways. Or how does all of this play out when migrant workers enter a country to work for suppliers who provide their goods up a supply chain, whose main beneficiaries are not a direct side to the agreement? They're not even in the country, but it benefits them, right? So perhaps I'm going too far, but I'm trying to think how to disentangle the different elements of the three elements that you characterize free zones with, and see how they coalesce in different contexts, and what can this tell us about the triad of state, corporation, workers, and especially how to promote workers' rights. Finally, a really quick comment. My fourth comment aims to highlight the productiveness of the free trade as zone versus free trade as border. Sorry, free trade zone as border versus the free trade zone as gift analysis, and transport it more largely to the question of migration governance as border control or as a gift, in a sense, human rights instrument, right? That in many ways, this is the trajectory of the research Yuval and I began with, and that many of us in this conference deal with. Is migration governance a form of control? Is it a human rights instrument? Can it be both? So I want to take it out from the free trade zone to generally to ask about this. So thank you very much, Jennifer, for opening up all these questions, and I really look forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Hila, and thank you both for keeping up with the time. Jennifer, would you like to respond quickly before we turn over to the other questions?
Just on two factual questions that Hila raised, because Hila, I just really appreciate your comments, and I would love to see a written version of them. That happens so fast. But you did ask a couple of questions, and one is with regard to whether there are investment treaties also operating in those zones. I believe in some cases there are, but I haven't looked specifically, so I've noted that to figure that out. And the second is whether there are BLAs that are specific to trade zones specifically. I think, and again, I will look more closely at this, I think the answer to that is that in Jordan, there are BLAs that are specific to the garment industry, which is exclusively located in the trade zones, but the BLAs don't articulate that connection. They act like, or you wouldn't know it looking at the BLA. The BLA just references the bringing in of workers for a particular industry, like any other BLA might for an industry. So again, I've noted that to look more carefully at it.
Terrific. So our first speaker is Margaret Peters.
Hi, I'm Maggie Peters. I'm from UCLA. Sorry for joining late. I had to play Legos this morning. You know, it happens. You have to play Legos. So I actually, Jennifer, I had a couple questions. One, I wanted to bring the government back in just a little bit. I'm a political scientist, by the way, so like that's what we think about. So we usually think, at least in political science, of special economic zones as a way to bring in jobs for locals, and especially since a lot of times foreign firms are actually paying slightly higher wages. It's really a boon to locals. So is what's going on, like what's the government's goal then if they have both a BLA and just attracting capital? Like, do they just want the tax revenue? What's their goal in this? Or is it just that foreign workers get pulled into these industries because wages might be higher, even though working conditions might be lower? Another example, when I think about migration in these special economic zones, my prototypical example is China. And I realize that's not international migration. It's internal migration. But of course, like if China wasn't one big country, it would be the largest flow. But I wonder if there's not something to be gained, given that China had and still has, the hukou system, which limits migration. If there's not something to be gained from looking at that example and see what's going on. I also wonder if maybe back in the early days when Singapore was establishing their export platform, they had some special economic zones. I don't think they've ever signed any BLAs, but they were definitely, I can't remember off the top of my head whether they've signed BLAs, but there were definitely worker programs. And then finally, I'm just going to do a plug for my own book because my book was all about the relationship between trade and migration. It's called Trading Barriers. So I just wanted to plug it because I think it might be relevant for how you think about it. It's just thinking a little bit more about how the government, it's a lot about, there's a whole chapter on lobbying, which maybe is helpful for you. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Maggie. Jennifer?
Yeah, just very quickly on the what's the government's goal question. Most of my paradigm cases are situations, setting Jordan aside for a moment, where the government set up the export zones with the idea that they would provide jobs for their own population. But the country's economy has developed, their education levels have risen, and local workers no longer want those jobs. Jordan is more complicated in many ways because the local workers never wanted those jobs, and the firms themselves are not Jordanian. They're coming from other places for reasons that I'm happy to talk about, but I don't think are so relevant for the BLA discussion. So in general, if I had to say what's the general principle, it would be that the local workers once did, but do no longer see those jobs as desirable and are therefore not cheap enough. And so the government has to import other workers, so to speak, to continue the inducement to invest.
Okay, Adam.
Hi, I found this so interesting. I did not know about the Jordan example or the other examples, Thailand, et cetera. And the Jordan example specifically, which is distinctive for the reason that you said, that it was set up to take advantage of the PTA and then to bring in the lower wage workers from the jump, is just so interesting conceptually that you're taking advantage of this. I guess I'll call it a comment, is I really like the concept of the double labor arbitrage of this feature of there being multiple international agreements, and firms are finding this like the middle of the Venn diagram where they can like take advantage of every loophole. And I think that some version of that term should be the title of the paper, and it's a totally new concept. Well, it's not totally new, as Maggie just said. Her book, other books talk about these things, but it's extremely interesting. The one thing I'd say is that the term itself is not quite working for me, the double labor arbitrage, because only one of the arbitrages is labor, the other one is tariffs. And so I don't know what the right term is, but thinking of a way to brand this, I don't know, the double international arbitrage or something, or multiple regulatory arbitrage, something is great, but it's, so I guess my comment is, it'd be great to find the exact right term and to make it the title, push it harder, et cetera, because it's so interesting.
Can I just quickly say something about that? I'm caught up in that same question about what's the right term, and I landed on double labor arbitrage because I do think that in a number of these situations, the firms are regularly going to other countries with the idea of using the lower cost labor there, right? They're not only investing because of the tariff issue, right? I think that that's only part of the motivation, and labor is the other one. And then they're doing the second move to make labor even cheaper. And so the first move is very complicated and labor is only a part of it, right? And so I take that to be related to your point. Certainly tariffs are key. So I will definitely think more about that. I probably won't use it for the title because I'm writing a larger piece about the whole, I would call it the spectrum, using Ila's words. And this is a slice of that. But I appreciate the push to be more clear with what I call it.
Thank you. Marianne Patterson.
Yes, thanks. I found it really interesting as well how your work has evolved about the Jordan Compact. And I like the zone as a gift, where you say that actually the Jordan Compact could be labeled as a good humanitarian policy, because that has not always been done in literature. I mean, the refugee work has been criticized by ILO and others. I would actually call it the zone as a Pandora box or something. I mean, now just applying it to the Jordan Compact, because first of all, in the Greek mythology, hope is the last thing to leave the Pandora box, which is perhaps how some of the refugee populations could feel. And second, also because the trade measures that are used in that context are actually not your normal trade. So it's actually full of exceptions, rules of origins being lifted on a time-limited basis, the general systems of preferences being granted to Jordan as an LDC, even though Jordan is not an LDC. So I'm trying to push you a little bit to think of, is it really the normal trade, or is it this preferential trade? And how does that affect the theory of substitution and complementarity of trade vis-a-vis migration? Because I think there are some issues in this Jordan Compact that are not yet really resolved, and that might also be a case why it has not been replicated on a broader basis in the terms of trade policy. But I'm really curious how your book and your project is going to develop, because I think it's a really fascinating nexus that you're into, also because it targets corporations, the corporate world, refugee world, in addition to migration and trade. Thank you.
Jennifer?
Just to say thank you, Marianne.
Yeah.
I found your work on the trade migration nexus and the points where we have intersected in the past on Jordan to be really helpful. So thank you for your comments.
Terrific. Are there any other comments or questions? Okay, wonderful. So this concludes our academic part of the day. We'll take a few minutes and then we'll switch over to our toast and our show and tell section of the